Good afternoon, everyone, and for those of you in Switzerland, almost good evening. I'm Bob Giuffra, and it's my privilege to be chair of the American Swiss Foundation. Um, we have a really great panel today on the upcoming U.S. election. Just to give everyone a preview, we're also having another panel on November 19th at 11:30 New York time, when we will talk about sort of the what we expect to happen in the next administration, assuming we have a winner by November 19th. There's certainly some speculation that we could have a replay of the 2000 election when we didn't have a winner. I think it was until December. But we have really two really of our most distinguished young leaders. Marie Harf, who was a young leader in 2019. She is the executive director of the Perry World House, which is the University of Pennsylvania's global think tank for politics and global affairs. She formerly served as a senior advisor for strategic communications, the U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry. She was foreign policy director of the Barack Obama 2012 reelection campaign. And then we have Guy Benson, a young leader for 2014. He's a commentator on Fox News. He's the political editor of townhall.com, which gets tens of millions of views literally every day. Really a huge website. And he's also the host of the nationally syndicated Guy Benson show. So, with only 6 days to go, I know many people probably are looking forward to finally having this election. It seems like it's gone on for 2 years, and we certainly don't do things like they do in the UK, where it's over in a month or two or even less. So, with only 6 days to go, Marie, what are the polling trends telling us about who is going to win this election?
If I could tell you that, I should put some money down in Vegas. It's so good to be with you and with my friend Guy Benson and with our friends in the US and Switzerland today. 6 days. I'm very excited for it to be over. I think Democrats will tell you, and this is true, that Donald Trump has never had more support in the polls than he has today. Throughout the decade plus he's been running for president, he has more support in national polls and in battleground state polls. Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden were both running well ahead of where Kamala Harris is running today in their respective races. So I will genuinely tell you, I think it is a toss-up. I work in Pennsylvania, as you mentioned, so I'm getting inundated with messaging from the campaign targeting different constituencies here, whether it's suburban women in Bucks County, whether it's Black men in inner city Philadelphia. A lot of focus on this state. But what I will say, and I think we'll probably talk about this a little later, is Democrats feel, despite the closeness of the polls, which is someone said yesterday to me that they are nauseously optimistic instead of cautiously optimistic, that they are sort of so anxious about this because Democrats feel very good about their ground game and their ability to turn out voters. And there are real doubts about the Republican Party's ability to do that. Historically, they haven't been quite as good at Democrats as actually getting their voters to the polls. And I think we will probably talk about this later, but there is a sense that pollsters may have overcorrected what in 2016 and 2020 was an undercount of Trump voters. They've done a lot of work to try and correct their models to make sure they're properly counting Trump voters. There's a fear, I think, or a hope maybe among Democrats that they've overcorrected, and they're actually now hidden Kamala Harris voters. And just this week, if you look at some of the numbers we've seen, for example, I'll just mention one constituency in Pennsylvania, Puerto Ricans. You know, Donald Trump's rally in Madison Square Garden had this speaker who said something quite offensive about Puerto Ricans. You have J-Lo and all these famous Puerto Ricans who are big American cultural icons, cutting ads, posting about it. We are starting to potentially see a couple numbers shift in the Puerto Rican community in Pennsylvania, which is hundreds of thousands of voters in a state that will be decided by not that many votes. So at the end of the day, 6 days left, we are focused really on some of those very targeted communities. You also see George Clooney and Julia Roberts cutting ads for the Harris campaign, telling suburban women basically, your vote is secret. No one has to know who you vote for. So really targeting those constituencies pretty carefully, Bob.
So, Guy, what do you think? Do you think that the polls are right, wrong? Who do you think is going to win? Have the pollsters overcorrected, undercorrected, or is this, 1980 all over again, and there's going to be a big Republican sweep?
Well, it's funny you mentioned that it feels like this election cycle has been going on for 2 years. That's because it has, right? Donald Trump announced he was running again 2 years ago, November, just after the midterms. So this has been 2 years, a slog. Very little happened for a long period, and then so many things happened in the span of about 3 months, starting in June at that debate, and then July, the convention, the assassination attempt, the first one against Trump, Biden getting forced out of the race. It's just, it got wild there for a while. And now we're in this, this final stretch of the campaign. Marie's right. Trump has never polled better. Arguably, he was polling a little bit better right before Biden dropped out, but he's kind of in some of the polls gotten near those levels again. Whether the polls are again going to underrepresent Trump voters, or they've overcorrected, so they're going to overrepresent, or maybe they've, the porridge is just right this time, is the, $1 trillion question. We don't know. We really don't know. I think it is plausible to probable that the pollsters have not corrected fully for this issue, because it's not even just that people are maybe shy about supporting Trump. I personally know a number of people who are voting for him this year for the very first time. They've never voted for him before. Several of them will not tell their friends or their neighbors about it. They're just sort of keeping it to themselves. But you also, I think, on the other hand, have a lot more people who are less shy about it than ever before. So maybe the shy Trump voter is less shy than we've seen in the past. Does that impact polling? What pollsters will tell you is it is really hard to get Republican leaning people generally to answer polls. It takes extra time and an opportunity and effort to get right leaning people to talk to pollsters. Whereas a certain demographic of more liberal voters will, they'll take every single poll, if in phone call they get, they love it. So it's like kind of different types of people. So I don't know. I think there is a possibility of any of those three being real. I think I would tip the scales ever so slightly to that they still haven't quite gotten it right, and that will maybe favor Trump a little bit, but I'm not fully confident of that. What I am confident of saying is if they are underestimating Trump's support again in the polling, he will win the election. If they are overestimating his support and they've overcompensated, then there's a very good chance that Harris will win the election. And if the polling is correct, it is an absolute jump ball. The Democrats might have a ground game advantage in some respects, but in some of the early voting that we've seen, especially in some of these sort of Sunbelt states, Republicans are doing, frankly, a lot better than I expected they even could, based on some of the questions I have about the ground game. So that's like three scenarios, one of which is like maybe a somewhat decisive-ish win for either one. And the middle one is just a white knuckle situation that might go for days.
One of the interesting questions is sort of what issues are animating the voters this year. And I think one of the things that's probably helping Trump is, the economy, the border, and potentially foreign affairs are issues that are favorable, for him. Harris is obviously focusing on more the character issues and probably abortion you see in the ads. What issues do you see as Maria, as the big issues in this election?
Well, you just named most of them. I think the
I've been re-
economy.
I've been watching a lot of TV anyway, or not TV, but at least reading the newspaper.
Exactly. You mentioned most of them. The economy, inflation, the cost of childcare, housing, sort of all of the issues related. The Biden-Harris administration has been frustrated that in many ways the economy is doing quite well, in many ways compared to other countries coming out of 2020 and the main COVID year is doing quite well. People are starting to feel it in many ways, but in some ways they're not. So the economy and Vice President Harris, if you watched her closing argument speech last night, if you watch her messaging, she is not shying away from it. She talks about her plan for housing. She talks about a small business tax credit. She talks about building out the middle class. And tries to compare that to Donald Trump and sort of how Democrats are portraying him as being much more favorable to corporations and to the wealthiest Americans. So she is not shying away from the fight on this issue, certainly. On the border, same thing. She has taken a much more moderate position than many Democratic candidates. She visited the border recently. She talks about her time as a prosecutor, but she is also very focused on abortion, women's health care, women's freedom, and health care in general. The Harris campaign this week was quite happy in some regards that Speaker Mike Johnson and the Trump people have been talking again about going after Obamacare, the ACA, health care, which this has been a political football for years now, but a lot of people get their healthcare through it and actually really like it. So this is going to turn out in many estimates to have more women vote for Kamala Harris. The gender gap on the female side, more for Harris than Trump than we've probably seen in modern history. But the flip is also true. More men, the gender gap on the male side, voting more for Donald Trump than Kamala Harris. So Trump has really focused a lot of his media outreach on these very niche sort of bro podcasts. She did Joe Rogan this week, his podcast, focusing on media that reaches
like 30 or 40 million people watch that podcast, which is incredible. And the other thing which is interesting is he seems to be doing better among African American men and Hispanic men than traditionally Republicans have done.
Well, we'll see. I'm curious, guys' thoughts on this. Some of the polling says that the Harris campaign has invested a ton, including in states like Pennsylvania, where I sit today, in reaching the Black community, particularly young Black males. She put out a whole plan designed to woo those voters back. And I think that some of the Trump comments in the rally I think a lot of this is not helping with parts of the Latino community in the final days. But those, and then finally, I'll stop at this, character. And not just character sort of amorphously, but Trump coming in with an enemies list and wanting retribution. And she's really leaning heavily into the fact that, a bunch of top Trump people, secretaries of defense, state chiefs of staff, say he is unfit to be president. That's a lot of her closing message is this is not someone you would hire in your business. And that's why she's touting endorsements from Dick Cheney and Liz Cheney and a bunch of Republicans, because she's really trying to bring in these disaffected Republicans who look at Donald Trump and say, I may like his policies on the economy, but I just don't believe he should have nuclear weapons at his fingertips.
Well, I mean, on the other hand, he was president for 4 years, so I'm not so sure that issue is resonating as much as folks would think it would. Guy, what's your response?
Well, I mean, there was an interesting sort of battle of leaks in the New York Times in the last couple of days between Harris's super PAC and Harris's campaign. The super PAC put out a message being like, stop going with all the fascist stuff. Stop saying that he's too old and he's too exhausted. These are not successful arguments. And they can't coordinate with the campaign legally, so they coordinated publicly via the New York Times. Then the campaign leaked to the New York Times 2 days later or whatever, saying, no, we're confident that this is working. So we'll see which of those two sides of Harris world is correct potentially here. Look, I think that Marie is right that Kamala Harris is trying to present on the economy and immigration, two of the top two issues, a different type of approach, a new way forward, as she calls it, than what the last 4 years have been. The problem for her is she's the sitting vice president. She's the incumbent. She was asked on national television, would you have done one single thing differently than what has been done by Biden the last 4 years? And she said, not a thing comes to mind, and hasn't really done better with that question when it was asked subsequently. And also, she is talking a slightly different game, certainly, on immigration than she has, not just for the past 4 years, but when she ran for president last time, not long ago, she was talking about decriminalizing border crossings, illegal border crossings, free health care plans to illegal immigrants paid for by taxpayers. She compared ICE to the KKK and said they should be abolished and started from scratch. I mean, she had some pretty wild positions out there. So I think going from that, like calling Trump's border wall un-American and antithetical to everything that we believe in, a medieval vanity project, to featuring it now in her ads, maybe she thinks that's going to move the needle for her. I just think a lot of Americans are very skeptical that she's authentically different on these issues. And that, I think, is going to be one of her biggest challenges here, to maybe an obstacle to winning the presidency. We'll see. On your question about, certain demographics, right? If you look at polling, it is true that especially among Black men, Trump's appeal has gone up. His support has gone up. Now, it's still, he's getting crushed overall in the demographic, but crushed by less, which matters in a very close election. Latinos the same way. It's the smallest gap we've seen in decades between Republicans and Democrats, especially men, to the point that Marie was making as well. We've seen this with rank and file union voters as well, Trump moving up, even closing the gap a little bit among younger voters. There are polling shows that Arab Americans are moving his direction, certainly compared to 4 years ago. So when you start looking at all these different demographic groups that seem to be moving his direction based on polling, there are two questions that come to my mind. Number one, does that polling data actually get reflected in votes? Right? We don't know that yet, right? People might be telling a pollster, oh, I'm going to do this, and then they don't, or they don't participate at all, which I think is another possible red flag for the Democrats. The other thing you have to ask yourself is, Donald Trump lost the Electoral College 4 years ago by a combined 44,000 votes in 3 states. If they flip 45,000 votes in 3 specific states, Arizona, Georgia, Wisconsin, he would have won that election. So if he's gaining even marginally, incrementally among all these groups that I just mentioned, where does he make up that gap? And what the Democrats will tell you is he'll make up that gap with women, with moderate voters, and with their ground game. And that's sort of like, that's the test of this election. Which one of those actually wins the day?
One of the things that I think if President Trump is reelected, that I think there'll be a lot of, sort of second guessing among Democrats about the decision by Joe Biden to run and not have a primary process. I must admit, I thought some of the most damaging video clips that I've seen of Vice President Harris has been when she's been on, CNBC, not CNBC, MSNBC, and some of the news programs recently answering questions in an unscripted way. And she just doesn't seem to have the experience level that one would have expected for campaigning because she wasn't tested through that primary process. Do you think do you think that Joe Biden will have a really hard time, getting his library built if she loses this election? And then there's a lot of finger pointing at him for, sort of running at 82 with a theoretical staying till late 86.
So, I mean, I think the president will have a presidential library. I think that will happen one way or another for him. I do think there will be a lot of finger pointing on either side. There's a lot at stake in the election. There have been some big gambles taken by both sides here. And so whichever one loses, there'll be something of a circular firing squad, and it could get ugly in the recriminations. And I think the post-election discussion that you guys are hosting will be very interesting on that front. I think on the Biden, so she had her speech last night. I was at a hockey game, so I didn't see any of it live. My phone started blowing up when Joe Biden was on some Zoom call trying to appeal to Hispanic voters, and he called Trump supporters garbage. And this was in retaliation for the thing at Madison Square Garden, which I think was a bad joke, and that guy should never have been invited, but I think it was massively overblown. Now we're talking about Joe Biden. I would love to have seen Kamala Harris's face when she got off stage and was informed what Joe Biden, from like 500 yards away, sitting at home, had just said.
Well, that was the mistake that Hillary Clinton made in 2016, which is called the Trump voters deplorables.
Yes. So I think that he is obviously a weight. She can't shed the weight completely for obvious reasons. So she's doing this unsatisfying dance, I think, for a lot of voters. And to your point, she actually was tested in a primary 5 years ago and flamed out before Iowa. So I think if Joe Biden had really done the thing that they're saying, oh, country first, it's the most selfless man ever, and he should be on Mount Rushmore, and all the over the top stuff they've said about him, I think if that were all true, he probably would have made this choice on his own 2 years ago and handed the baton over to an actual process rather than this short-circuited process. Look, if she wins, they're going to say, ooh, that was close, but we got away with it, and now we can sort of start over again here. If they lose, I think we will get so many books about the internal drama and all of this stuff, and I will be a voracious consumer of those books. I will, but we'll see.
Marie, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, first, I've watched that Joe Biden clip. I don't think he was calling all Trump supporters garbage. I think he was calling the comedian garbage. I will also say, as a Democrat who appears
Trump
on
said actually that he didn't even know the comedian was going to be, on, and he didn't pick the comedian. It's just, I mean, it's sort of.
Yes, I will say I'm a Democrat I appear on a conservative news network. Donald Trump and JD Vance call my party communists, anti-Christian, anti-American. Like they say all manner of terrible things about Democrats too. So the pearl clutching by Republicans over a Joe Biden potential gaffe is a little rich for me. I will say, for Donald Trump says terrible things about my party every single day. So, our politics is kind of in the gutter, and I don't like that. I will say, but look, as I agree with you about Biden, there are lots of reports that after the 2022 midterms where Democrats greatly overperformed what the polls said and what historically in a midterm should have happened for an incumbent party. That instead of everyone thought after the midterms, he would sit down and really actually have a process and say, okay, is this feasible? Is it not? What should I do? That because the Democrats won so or did so much better than they should have done, that process never happened. And there are a lot of Democrats who believe that Joe Biden's legislative achievements are quite significant, particularly domestically. And so that process never happened. You're absolutely right that both of you are right, if Democrats do not win this election, the questions about what Biden deciding to run will be the most important one. I think some of the Biden people are going to say if he had stayed in, he would have won, which I think is complete nonsense and is at odds with reality. But look, we have both parties, if the party that doesn't win, if Donald Trump loses, I think there's going to be a huge conversation, hopefully in the Republican Party. Did he do enough to get Nikki Haley voters? Was it, I think there will be, whoever loses will have a very difficult holiday season and next couple months thinking about how that happened. In the face of what both sides see on that their opponent has significant weaknesses.
And I would just say about the midterm elections, because I actually think it's quite important. Number one, I think Republicans were overconfident going into the midterms based on a bunch of fundamentals.
On historical data, you would have thought that in the midterm election, normally the president's party loses.
Totally. So I think that they were overconfident in some ways, and there's been a shift among high and low propensity voters. They've kind of traded parties in some ways. So the presidential very well could be different. So, but I think the overconfidence thing is still a very relevant warning today for the Trump campaign and for the Republicans. I think there's maybe a little too much triumphalism on the right that I think could be unfounded. Maybe they're right, maybe not. But I also
think it all goes back to what we talked about at the beginning, which is, are the polls right or are the polls wrong, and have they been corrected? Because clearly, if the polls haven't been corrected, we're looking at a Trump landslide. If he's even and he was like 8 or 9 points behind Hillary Clinton and behind Biden in 2000, the polls were off by 5 and 10 points in both elections.
In some places, right? So nationally,
we
Hillary,
just don't know.
Yeah.
Let me ask another question. I mean, I Post, I read the New York Times, I read the Wall Street Journal. I think it's fair to say I've never seen, the press coverage is a lot different than when I was growing up and we got our news from Walter Cronkite. I'm dating myself. How do you think how would you rate the way the press is covering this election? I mean, on the Trump side, you sort of had the John Kelly, said Trump's a fascist, and then they run with that, which is a, pretty, aggressive and unfounded, allegation, but gets front page news. And then, obviously the New York Post is the New York Post. What's the state of journalism in America right now?
Guy has many thoughts on this. Do you want to start, my friend? Would you like me?
I mean, I think it boils down to the vast, vast majority of journalists in America are liberal Democrats. They are the hardcore activist base of their party. They are acting very much that way with their jerseys fully on over these last few weeks in particular. They can careen from saying this is a Hitler fascist Nazi rally at Madison Square Garden. Look at all these Nazis, to, oh, we're offended by this insult comics joke, to, oh, Joe Biden saying the garbage thing doesn't really matter that much. It's just whatever. It's like it's rapid response for the Democrats is what we generally see from many, many, many journalists. We saw a Gallup poll last week that shows Trust in media has absolutely cratered, I think, to catastrophic levels. It's gone down among Republicans and independents and Democrats. Democrats still have majority trust in the media because that they're on the same side, but independents and Republicans, it's just absolutely in the toilet. So overall, the media is doing what they have done now for years, but worse and more shamelessly. And I think some of the internecine meltdowns we're seeing in newsrooms over like not endorsing someone that they all obviously support is certainly interesting. And so my opinion is rather low.
I am.
Okay,
Yeah,
Marie.
go ahead. Well, I'll just say briefly, I think that the press on the flip side still haven't, after all these years, figured out how to cover Donald Trump. I mean, I do think it is a national news story that his former chief of staff, not a liberal, pretty far right, called him a fascist. Like that is something that happened. You can agree with it or not, but he did it.
He said some pretty, not negative things about President Trump, 2 and 3 years ago.
Exactly. So that's why I think in part it's newsworthy, right? I mean, it's interesting because
It's
most
more, I
of
think
what
the timing of it is, I think, the question.
ask John Kelly what his time, like this is, you see John Kelly, Mark Milley. I mean, it is not a story that so many of these people that have worked for Donald Trump believe that he does not have respect for basic democratic institutions. That's not my word. That's Mark Milley's word, who again, not a liberal, I can assure you. But they haven't quite figured out how to cover Trump. Is he an entertainer? Yes. Is he a character? Yes. But the language he uses is quite different, whether you like it or not, than any other candidate in modern history, certainly. Mitt Romney, George W. Bush, John McCain. And they haven't, I mean, to Guy's point, they go back and forth between covering him, I think, like a celebrity and covering him like the next Hitler, which is a term his vice president used about him, not a term I'm using about him, his vice presidential nominee. So they can't quite figure out what to do. And I think, yeah, I mean, I think and so much of media, there's also a huge right-wing media ecosystem that is incredible, conservative media that is incredibly powerful. I mean, Guy writes for a very well-respected conservative outlet, right? That a lot of Americans read. So
I think part of what's gone on is people get news in many different ways. And I think, I like when I read the New York Times, I read it knowing that it's the New York Times. When I read the New York Post, I read it because I know it's the New York Post.
yeah, of course.
The only place you probably get the news completely straight is in the sports pages. But if you read multiple papers, you can sort of get a feel for what's going on and make your own
Yeah.
judgment. We only have a minute or two left. Let me ask both of you just a quick question. Do you think we'll know who the winner is on election night? Or do you think this drags out? I'm very actually concerned about that, just as a citizen of the United States. If this goes on for weeks and weeks, and we have a replay of the 2000 recount, with hopefully we don't have hanging chads anymore. And Florida has done a pretty good job of making their elections efficient.
That's true. I will go very briefly and then I'll give Guy the last word. I don't think it'll go months and months and weeks. I think in 2020 we called it on Saturday. I think it is the most likely scenarios we will not know on election night. I think the earliest is probably Wednesday midday. I think it is likely that it will go a few days. I am concerned about what people, we saw this in 2020. President Trump said, early in some states, it looks like someone's up, it looks like someone's down. It depends on what votes have been counted. And it really is incumbent upon everyone to keep the temperature low in that time period, because there will be mirages of what votes look like. But I don't think it'll go months, and I don't think it'll go to the Supreme Court, God willing, but I do not think we will know on election night. I think Guy and I will be up till like 3 a.m. and not know when we go to bed.
I would say a couple of the states that are really contested have actually improved their systems, Georgia, Michigan. So that could help a little bit. We might not know the House for quite a while because California, New York take forever to count. My hot take actually is that we might very well know on election night, actually.
Oh, really?
It really depends on whether the polls are right or
Here's
wrong.
Why. Let me explain.
I'm
not taking that prediction, but I think that there's a good chance that we will. And now I'll date myself. So the elections that I've been alive for, 1988, we knew either on election night or early the next morning is what I'm talking about. 1988, 1992, we knew. 1996, we knew. 2000, famously, we did not. 2004, we knew. 2008, we knew. 2012, we knew. 2016, we knew. 2020, obviously, we did not. So the norm is to know relatively soon. Now, it is possible, I opened with those three scenarios. If it's the middle scenario where it's down to a tiny number of votes in a tiny handful of states, then yes, this will drag out. But sometimes in elections, dominoes tend to fall the same direction. And if we start to see, okay, that state wasn't as close as we thought it would be, and wow, that state is closer than we thought it would be, and it's kind of in the same direction, I think that there is a real chance that that happens on Tuesday. I think there's a slightly better chance that that happens in Trump's favor, but not a non-zero chance that happens in her favor. And under that circumstance, I think that there's a reasonable chance that we will know either on Tuesday or in the wee hours of the morning on Wednesday. Not a prediction, but I'm tamping down some expectations that this thing's going to drag forever. Maybe it's
okay. Any final? We'll give it one more minute. Any final comments? Marie?
I
was just exhausted by the by the
yeah.
election process.
To Guy's point, so little happened in this election cycle for so long, and then everything happened all at once, and it feels I've been Guy and I have been doing politics for a long time. I feel so uncertain about my ability to know what will happen next Tuesday, much more so than any other election cycle. And I think I just want the country to get through this because it's been a really difficult summer for all of us, and summer and fall in many ways. And I'm just worried about what comes next. But
you've got the what you think in our job, like the known knowns and then the known unknowns. And what's been disorienting in the last number of years is some of the known knowns are actually wrong. And then all of a sudden you're like, wait a second, there's this whole new thing that comes out of left field. You're like, well, that I was not expecting that. So it makes it hard to make good quality predictions because things are a little wild. The one thing I'll say in my close is no matter who wins, I think the Republicans probably have an edge in the Senate. The Democrats and the Republicans are like knife's edge in the House. There's a decent chance there'll be some degree of divided government. And there is a boatload of stuff coming up immediately in 2025 that is going to be a giant mess politically for whichever party is in charge or some combination of the parties. So like we'll have this election, we'll have the results. There'll be, rending of garments, gnashing of teeth, celebrations, all of that, then a big deep breath, and then a very, very bumpy road ahead, both in terms of like policy and governance and politically over the next 2 to 4 years. So we have that to look forward to. And at least
both of you will be very busy, and we'll have plenty of good material for our webinars, which we'll have our new webinar. The next webinar will be on November 19th again at 11:30. And one final word from me for our Swiss friends. I think the bottom line is democracy is very well and alive in the United States, notwithstanding what people say. I mean, my sense is there's lots of television ads, there's lots of debate, there's lots of discussion, and we will have free and fair elections. Next Tuesday. It's actually going on. I was able to vote already. We have early voting, and so I mean, I think it's this is a very democratic country. There may be a lot of fighting amongst one another, and the one thing I'd like to see is maybe less of that. But we certainly have. There's certainly people's views are being taken into account and getting their opportunity to vote. And again, it's going to be very exciting, and we look forward to seeing everyone on November 19th. And I think that's maybe a week after our Young Leaders Conference, which is coming up in Basel, Switzerland, sponsored by Novartis. And we want to thank our friends from Swiss for flying everyone over. We're up to now 1,500 young leaders. So thank you both, Guy and Marie, and you've both been great. And I know Faith Whittlesey would be very happy watching the show. A good fair debate and a good airing of all the issues. So thank you all very much. Take care.
Thank you.